Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, South Africa's #1 business news website. And it's time to talk about ESG. And I can almost hear some people out there cringing a little bit. ESG has become this TLA, this three-letter acronym that sadly, I think, has lost a lot of its meaning. There's a lot of cynicism around environmental, social governance investing. And it doesn't mean it's any less important. But what we have seen is some big scandal. Deutsche Bank was involved in a scandal earlier this year for misleading investors about its ESG credentials and the way it was investing. And I do think we've seen a lot of green marketing that doesn't really live up to what it says on the tin. But it doesn't mean it's any less important. And it's certainly an issue. And I've been covering markets almost 20 years. That was at the backwater about 15 years ago, but has now come almost to the center of the conversation as we talk about the various risks that companies are facing, because these risks have a material impact on the bottom line. And to talk about the rise of ESG investing and what this all means for the future for banks in particular, I'm joined now by Monocle's Guy Wilding. And Guy, always a pleasure to have you on the show. When we talk about ESG and climate risk, they really have become buzzwords in financial services. What does this all mean for our financial services industry and in particular banking?
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, for having me on. So I think a good place to start is essentially just understanding the role of banking, and that boils down to funding and then effectively allocating capital. And that's been banking for the last sort of 400 years with, fractional reserve banking. And while banking has maybe gotten more complex and financial services have gotten more sophisticated, there's new risks that arise, and very kind of, the most prominent one is that we can think back to is the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And there was a reaction now of regulation around that. How do we mitigate that risk going forward in terms of liquidity crises being, our financial institutions being over leveraged. And so there's a reactive nature in making sure that something like that doesn't happen again. Yeah. The interesting thing from a climate risk perspective, and ESG included, is it's more of a proactive approach. And so while there are climate events that are becoming more severe and more frequent, regulators and sort of the market is looking at a long-term view of how is this as a risk, these changing weather patterns and the climate in general going to affect funding decisions and capital allocation. So it's all about the effective capital allocation around that. And so from a climate risk perspective, for banking in particular, I'll say there's kind of three subtitles or subtypes. The first being physical, which is what we often think of in terms of flooding and those and fires and heat waves, events that we often think about with climate. And from a South African perspective, think about the KwaZulu-Natal flooding. And I read recently that one of our insurers said that it was the most challenging underwriting event in their 100-year history. So that gives you a little bit of a taste.
I just want to add to that, Guy. It's so interesting. I was chatting to an academic from the University of KwaZulu-Natal shortly after the floods, because they had published a paper before the floods. It predated the floods by a couple of months. And it was the result of a long-term study looking at the sediment off the Durban coast, going back 9,000 years in the geological sense of time, back to the warm period, where they deduced with their colleagues from two other universities based in Europe that these kinds of weather events, when we are going through that warm period, were much more frequent, and it's therefore likely that we can expect much more of these flooding type events into the future, which kind of makes intuitive sense. But he says, no one wanted to talk to us apart from the actuaries at the big insurers. As soon as we published that report, they were beating a path down to our door. And it just shows you how financial services are thinking about this risk, because it then translates into how you price insurance. How do you do your underwriting?
Yeah, exactly. And I think for insurers, it's been something that's probably been on their radar for a while, just considering the nature of their business. But for banks and potentially asset managers, this hasn't been something that they've necessarily considered in previous decisions, before the rise of sort of the ESG mandate or mandate in terms of building it out. Yeah, and then I mean, going back to there's the physical side, which you kind of mentioned with that kind of increasing severity, and then maybe on the other side of it, it's almost like a seesaw is transition risk, and so that is the risk of changing prices and changing business models, and the risk that comes with it as we move to a greener economy. And a big example for a South African or for South Africans is Eskom. And if Eskom, financed through bonds, if those become unfavorable and that investors are no longer looking to lend to companies like Eskom, that's seriously damaging for their finances going forward. And then I think a risk that's becoming more and more prominent is legal risk, and something that maybe not as concentrated on as the previous two. But legal risk is becoming quite a concern because a lot of financial institutions are starting to put out objectives and targets that are now being challenged in court. And we're seeing this a lot in Europe. I was reading recently about a case in Germany where one of their electricity providers could be paying the cost of climate mitigation infrastructure and projects in countries like Peru, who are being affected by the emissions that these companies are putting into the atmosphere that's affecting everybody in the world.
Wow. I mean, that's remarkable. And we also had, that division of Deutsche Bank, DWS, and the SEC began investigating them last year after an ex-employee said it fudged its ESG info to woo investors. So, I mean, you're going to be caught out if you are greenwashing in the space as well. How do you see climate risk management in financial services unfolding today, given that you've got this physical transition and a legal risk lens through which now you've got to view how you operate in this environment?
Yeah. So I think for banks especially, there's going to be a time of reflecting and sort of refining what that means for their business. And so I think the first steps around considering these new risks is understanding your balance sheet. Understanding where there's a concentration and what the various industries you're lending to, and then understanding what is green and what is not considered to be, or maybe brown. What are these assets that are carbon intensive? And I think that initial process is definitely where financial services need to start, because a large problem, and I think you were kind of alluding to in the beginning, is ESG has become a buzzword, and it can actually mean anything. That's why there is such a big amount of greenwashing. And so there is this sort of double-edged sword where you want to, as a financial organization, be proactive, but also there's a bit of a catch-up that needs to be in place from regulators and governments as they define what is ESG, what does climate risk management actually look like in a financial services organization.
And I think it's that taxonomy that is critical. I was chatting to David Gerald at Bowman's earlier about how advanced the European taxonomy is. In South Africa, we're still a little bit behind. And I think it's important because of that, and to your point, that's where the cynicism starts from, because we can focus on the E, but what about the S? In the South African context, it's no good decarbonizing if you're going to create socioeconomic turmoil, if it's going to lead to further job losses, it's going to destabilize your country politically. Yet, you're cleaner than Caesar's wife on the E front. So you need this holistic kind of taxonomy in order to understand this. And within the broader context of this, what do you think of the policy environment that we're seeing in South Africa? Are we getting there? Are we still several years behind? Where do you see us on that spectrum?
Yeah. So South Africa has released its taxonomy as well, and I think that they've gone in the right direction of basing a lot of their taxonomy methodology around very similar to the EU, to the European Union, and that is very important because we're trying to move towards a standardized, sort of globally accepted view of those requirements. So I think from a South African perspective, that's a good step in the right direction. But I do think maybe from a financial services perspective, there is there is a lack of direction, and I think in certain instances, especially around maybe more of the quantitative elements of climate risk in terms of reporting and measuring your various metrics around ESG and climate risk, and then managing that. So actually assessing it with scenario planning and stress testing. These are things that are and it's not just a South African view, but I think internationally, it's trying to figure out what is best practice, and what is going to provide sort of this balance between not knocking the profitability of our financial services, but balancing that move to green that is so important, not just for the financial services industry, but for the citizens of the world and for South Africans.
And I think globally, we've got, what is it, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. I mean, if you're looking for a lodestar to see where the world is heading, that's probably a good place to start. And we do have our own taxonomy, as you mentioned, very similar to the EU's. But within all of that, I think very safe to say that probably the easiest part of this, if you look at the ESG spectrum to tackle, has got to be around emissions, because I think for me, that's easily quantifiable quantitatively. I think when you start to talk about social issues, what are the potential job losses? What are the impacts on around surrounding communities? That becomes a little bit more qualitative and to me a little bit more fuzzy. What with the discussion around standardization and obviously this need for comparative disclosure, how do you see emissions data and reporting looking to solve these issues?
Yeah, you mentioned the TCFD, so Task Force for Financial Disclosure, and I think that's becoming another really important part of the sort of policy landscape, something that is kind of becoming globally accepted, and many regulators and governments are building off that. And so that disclosure goes through governance, strategy, it goes through risk management, and then onto metrics and key reporting. And so I think that's where emissions is coming to the fore in that category. And so TCFD are recommending, and especially for financial services, emissions reporting. And so, like you mentioned, it's moving away from a qualitative approach to a very quantifiable, measurable, and hopefully standardized view of climate risk, sort of taking out those gray areas or that sort of murkiness and grounding it in numbers. And so, from that perspective in emissions, there's a breakdown of what banks and firms will need to report. And so there's a breakdown of three types or scopes. Scope one being direct emissions, which is, if we think of it from a banking perspective, it's the emissions that a building or your offices produce or your car fleet produces. Scope two is your indirect emissions, which is that are produced from purchased electricity. So to make sure that your infrastructure is running, you've got to obviously have that power through Eskom power and the emissions that it produces. And then most importantly is scope three. And that is all indirect emissions across your supply chain. And from a banking perspective, that includes financed emissions, which is a really significant element of reporting that's sort of being built and discussed internationally. And so, there's been estimates that financed emissions, the emissions that come from your investments and the funding that banks provide, that could be 700 times more than what banks are producing as an entity.
Yeah.
And, let's not forget, banking is a digital service, so their emissions impact are very low, but the clients that they are funding can have quite large emission output. So there's definitely a drive now and debate around the cost of trying to get this emissions data, because it's going to be a massive exercise of looking through your entire balance sheet and understanding what emissions you're responsible for reporting, and the cost and the benefit behind that. Is this going to be useful to drive that climate change and that policy that governments are looking for?
And that's the weeds here that we're getting into, because I think that's really challenging. And, for example, is a target by a financial institution like a bank to reduce exposure to fossil fuels, for example, because banks are big funders of oil, gas, and coal, expressed as a percentage of your overall group loans, an emissions intensity kind of measure. Because my problem with using that as an intensity measure is that you need to understand the underlying actual spend of both the numerator and the denominator. Your fossil fuel exposure might not change at all, but you increase your loans in other ways, and that percentage would go down. But it's not really reflective of progress with carbon emissions here. So it's really difficult. And I know banks like Investec, for example, disclose the absolute amounts for coal, oil, and gas. So you can see what's really being financed. But these are the challenges, aren't they?
No, definitely, and I think there will be a requirement for diverse reporting, and reading from what's happening in the European Union, I think they're in many ways on the cutting edge. They're looking at this green asset ratio, and it's very similar to what you had mentioned around. It's the ratio of your sustainable assets divided by all the assets on that the bank has. Now, that's almost being seen as this sort of almost a holy grail number. And I think there's a bit of backlash, or there is backlash coming out of that, because the methodology is not complete. So it relies on the taxonomy of defining what is green, and that's not complete yet. So those assets are excluded. The trading book is excluded from this calculation at the moment. So it's just the banking book, and so that reduces standardization, and it reduces comparability, and so maybe the efficiency of these metrics. And so I think what's coming out now, and what the realization is there needs to be diverse reporting and diverse metrics, and that goes between, like you mentioned, having absolute reporting, relative measures for comparability, and then looking at it in terms of various other sort of filters. So we need to have data across time and industries and maturities. And then another really important point is additional disclosure and unpacking these decisions, because we shouldn't be focused on banks divesting completely from these dirty assets. There is a massive need for sustainable investing that is funding the transition. So carbon capture technology. Now, if that loan is going into a dirty business, in quotation marks, it's going to come out on a ratio looking like you're funding these companies for the wrong reasons. And I think that just speaks to the fact that it's very nuanced, and I think there's a definite need to build out some certainty, but disclose and analyze that further.
That is such a fascinating point, because at the end of the day, what you might be doing, and again, if you look at this from a shareholder perspective, and there's BlackRock, Larry Fink writing letters to CEOs, we're invested in your companies, we want to know what you're disclosing, we want to know what your plans are to reach net zero. But because we're part of this together, it's a transition. We're not going to divest. We're not going to vote with our capital and go somewhere else. We're going to ensure that we're here and we're applying the pressure, but in a positive way, to transition you from point A to point B, C, D down the line to get to net zero. And my concern with this is that you drive a lot of this funding into the private debt markets, where there isn't as much disclosure, there isn't the same kind of pressure to move. And ultimately, that won't achieve anything if you believe that the overarching goal here is to reach some kind of net zero target out into the distant future. I don't know if 2050 is the right date, but that's why I agree with you, Guy. It's a very nuanced conversation and challenges. Just as the last thought, and speaking of challenges, you addressed some of them. Are those the main ones that you're seeing the banks run into, specifically here in South Africa at the moment, as they try to build out and integrate their climate risk management operations?
So definitely the risk of not having a standardized and a sort of concrete regulation or direction is a big risk. And we've spoken to that, and I think the other two risks that sort of come to mind, or problems, are a lack of sort of adequate assessment tools and data. Data is a big problem. So if we look at assessment tools, scenario planning and scenario analysis has come to the fore with its forecasting ability. So, like you mentioned, we need to forecast 30 years into the future, 2050. Even some cases, 100 years into the future with these impacts. And there are very much limitations when it comes to stress testing and scenario analysis at that time length across those years. And the assumptions become quite difficult, and then it's translating climate and environmental pathways or scenarios into financial inputs into your models, and that can be quite difficult. And I think financial services are still struggling to wrap their head around that and build some sort of world-class and world-adopted methodologies. And the other side is data. Data is going to be a massive problem. Mentioning it before, this is not something that banks have been, if we think about emissions, have been recording or requesting from their clients in the past. And so the requirements, if they do come down the line for state or scope 3 emissions reporting, will be a significant challenge for banks. And there will obviously need to be allowances for the use of proxies. There are certain third-party data providers that will fill the gap. But it is going to be an iterative process that's going to have speed bumps. And then, looking at America, I was reading today that the SEC have come out under a bit of pressure for their promotion of scope 3 emissions reporting, because guys are saying that this is going to cost a huge amount of money, to put that responsibility on financial services could potentially be another drag. And like you mentioned, it's going to push funding away from these over-regulated industries into more shadow banking, into industries that offer this sort of competitive advantage in terms of anti-ESG, and then we defeat the whole point of trying to over-regulate and move to an ESG landscape.
Well, difficult to balance all of that, but it's I think it's quite clear that ESG isn't a destination. It's really in itself, I think it's a journey just towards building a better, more sustainable planet. And I think we fundamentally, if you agree with the science, which the IPCC says is fairly conclusive. I mean, over 90% of the world scientists do agree that we've got to act to keep warming at least below 1.5 degrees. And if we can't start thinking about adaptation and the like, banks have to ask and answer the why at every stage, and not be swayed by what's trendy, what's cynical. And I think ultimately that will lead to an internal kind of reform that doesn't require over-regulation, which, to your point, can drive too much in the opposite direction as well. Guy Wilding, Monocle Solutions, thank you very much for taking us on a tour through the latest issues in the realm of ESG here on Business Talk. Take care.